The law of a mind that refuses to break. A positive mental attitude is not smiling while your life falls apart. It is keeping control of your mind when everything around you is trying to take control of it. That is the difference between an ordinary person and someone who becomes impossible to break. Most people call reality anything that weakens them. They wake up tired, look at their problems, listen to the news, feel pressure from bills, notice the coldness of people, remember old frustrations, and without realizing it, they hand their mind over to the environment. They do not choose their internal state. They simply react. But here is the central law of this video. A mind that never learns how to interpret life with power will eventually be controlled by everything happening outside of it. You may have talent. You may have plans. You may have faith. You may even desire a greater life. But if every difficulty can change your energy, destroy your focus, weaken your discipline, change the way you speak, and pull you back into old patterns, then your mind still does not belong to you. It belongs to circumstances. And maybe that is why you start motivated, but lose momentum so quickly. Maybe that is why you promise yourself you will change, but one criticism is enough to shake you. Maybe that is why you work hard, pray, visualize, try to stay positive. But the moment a problem appears, your mind falls back into fear, complaint, and doubt. Because a positive mental attitude is not repeating beautiful phrases. It is internal training. It is emotional discipline. It is invisible self-government. It is the ability to look at a difficult situation and say, "This will not decide who I become." In this video, you will understand why some people remain strong even in negative environments, while others collapse under the smallest pressure. And more importantly, you will learn how to develop a positive mental attitude so strong that reality may test you, but it can no longer control you. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every video here is designed to strengthen your mind, expand your awareness, and help you build a life with more clarity, direction, and purpose. And comment below, "My mind does not bend." Write it with intention. Because from this moment forward, you will not simply try to think positive. You will learn how to become mentally unbreakable. The mistake of thinking positivity means thinking happy thoughts. Most people completely misunderstand what a positive mental attitude really is. They think being positive means pretending everything is fine. They think it means smiling through pain, avoiding negative thoughts, repeating affirmations, forcing optimism, acting calm while internally collapsing. But that is not mental strength. That is emotional theater. And eventually, reality exposes it. Because the first real problem, the first betrayal, the first financial pressure, the first season of uncertainty, reveals whether your positivity was built on discipline or on emotional comfort. And this is where most people fail. Not because they are weak, but because they built their mentality on feelings instead of principles. They feel positive when life is easy. They feel confident when things are working. They feel motivated when they receive attention, validation, results, or progress. But the moment life becomes heavy, their entire identity changes. Their language changes. Their energy changes. Their focus disappears. Their discipline weakens. Their vision shrinks. And here's the dangerous part. They think the problem is the situation. It is not. The real problem is that their internal state depends entirely on external conditions. That means the environment controls the person. And a person controlled by the environment can never build a powerful life consistently. Because success demands emotional stability, not emotional reaction. Now understand something deeper. A positive mental attitude does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to let reality dictate your internal government. That is different. Very different. A mentally weak person sees a setback and immediately creates an identity around it. I always fail. Nothing works for me. My life is difficult. People are against me. This is impossible. Notice what happens. The event becomes a conclusion. A temporary moment becomes a permanent identity. And this silent process destroys more dreams than lack of talent ever could. Because every thought repeated with emotion becomes mental programming. And eventually, programming becomes personality. This is why some people remain trapped in cycles for years. Not because they lack opportunity, but because they rehearse defeat internally every single day. Now compare that to someone mentally disciplined. When pressure appears, they do not deny the difficulty. They simply refuse to surrender their identity to it. They may feel pain, stress, fear, uncertainty, but they do not build a home inside those emotions. They observe them, control them, redirect them. That is power. And this reveals another truth most people avoid. Your mind is always listening to the way you describe your life. Every complaint teaches weakness. Every excuse reinforces limitation. Every repeated negative interpretation trains your brain to expect defeat. This is why two people can face the same situation and leave with completely different futures. One becomes bitter. The other becomes stronger. One sees proof of failure. The other sees training. One collapses emotionally. The other develops internal authority. The circumstance was the same. The interpretation was different. And interpretation shapes destiny. But here is what almost nobody realizes. There is a hidden force silently destroying positive mental attitudes before they even become strong. A force that looks harmless, normal, even socially accepted. And if you do not identify it, you will keep sabotaging your own mind without noticing. Because the next level of this conversation is not about positivity. It is about mental contamination. Why most people collapse when reality gets heavy. Most people do not lose their strength during tragedy. They lose it during repetition. That is the part nobody talks about. It is not always the major crisis that destroys a person. Sometimes it is the accumulation of small frustrations, small disappointments, small delays, small emotional wounds, repeated over months and years. And little by little, the mind becomes tired. Not physically tired, internally tired. A dangerous kind of exhaustion begins to appear. The exhaustion of carrying negative interpretations every single day. Because every time you wake up already expecting stress, already expecting conflict, already expecting failure, your nervous system adapts to survival mode. And survival mode kills vision. This is why so many people stop dreaming after a certain age. Not because they became realistic, but because they became emotionally conditioned to disappointment. Now pay attention to this carefully. A person with a weak mental attitude does not need a catastrophe to collapse. Sometimes all it takes is a bad morning, an unanswered message, a criticism, a delayed result, a financial problem, someone doubting them, or one difficult season. And suddenly, their energy disappears. Why? Because their emotional stability was never built internally. It was rented from circumstances. That means when circumstances change, a person changes too. And this creates one of the most destructive patterns in life. Inconsistency. 1 week motivated. 1 week defeated. 1 day disciplined. The next day emotionally lost. 1 moment believing in the future. The next moment questioning everything. This instability quietly destroys wealth, relationships, focus, health, opportunities, and self-respect. Because life rewards emotional endurance, not emotional intensity. Anybody can feel powerful for 1 day. Anybody can feel inspired after watching a motivational video. Anybody can speak confidently when life is comfortable. But the real test begins when nothing around you validates your effort, when results are delayed, when nobody applauds you, when progress feels invisible, when you are forced to continue without emotional reward. That is where mentality is revealed. And most people fail this test because they are addicted to emotional stimulation. They only move when they feel like it. But highly disciplined people understand something deeper. Feelings are unstable. Principles are not. That means they stop asking, "How do I feel today?" and start asking, "Who do I choose to be today?" That question changes everything. Because the moment identity becomes stronger than emotion, consistency begins to appear. And consistency creates power. Now here is another hidden problem. Many people unknowingly train themselves to focus on what is wrong all day long. Think about modern life. News built on fear. Social media built on comparison. Conversations built on complaint. Entertainment built on distraction. Most people spend hours feeding the mind anxiety and then wonder why they cannot stay positive. That is like pouring poison into water and expecting it to become clean by itself. Impossible. Your mind becomes whatever you repeatedly expose it to, which means negativity is not always a dramatic event. Sometimes it is simply prolonged exposure. Exposure to weak conversations, weak environments, weak thinking, weak reactions, weak standards. And eventually, the mind adapts downward. This is why mentally strong people protect their focus aggressively. They understand something the average person ignores. Attention is spiritual currency. Whatever receives your attention begins shaping your identity. And if you constantly feed your mind fear, chaos, distraction, outrage, gossip, and emotional noise, your internal world will eventually mirror it. But this leads to a deeper question. If the environment influences the mind so strongly, why do some people remain powerful even inside negative environments? Why do some people continue building discipline, clarity, confidence, and purpose while everyone around them stays emotionally weak? The answer reveals the invisible cause behind mental strength. And once you understand it, you will never look at your own mind the same way again. The invisible cause. Your mind still obeys the environment. Here is the truth most people never realize. The majority of human beings are not consciously thinking. They are reacting. Reacting to headlines. Reacting to opinions. Reacting to moods. Reacting to pressure. Reacting to memories. Reacting to the emotional climate around them. And after years of constant reaction, they mistake emotional programming for personality. That is why so many people say things like, "This is just who I am." No. In many cases, that is simply who your environment trained you to become. Now understand how dangerous this is. If your mind automatically changes based on what surrounds you, then your internal world is not under your control. It is under external command. And a person who cannot govern their internal world will eventually become a prisoner of circumstances. This is why some people enter a room full of negativity and instantly become negative too. One complaint changes their energy. One difficult conversation ruins their entire day. One stressful moment destroys their focus. One rejection makes them question their value. Because their emotional state has no independent foundation. It depends on what is happening outside. But mentally powerful people operate differently. They do not absorb every emotional atmosphere they enter. They filter it. That is one of the greatest forms of discipline a human being can develop. The ability to decide what deserves entry into the mind. Because not everything deserves emotional access to you. And this is where most people lose their power without noticing. They consume everything, every opinion, every distraction, every criticism, every negative prediction, every fearful voice. They open the doors of the mind to chaos, and then wonder why they feel internally unstable. But here is the deeper truth. Your mind was never designed to function without direction. If you do not consciously command it, the environment will command it for you. And the environment rarely trains greatness. It trains reaction. Think about how most people live. They wake up and immediately consume noise, phone, notifications, problems, stress, comparison, urgency. Before their own mind even has time to breathe, the external world already occupies their attention. And slowly, this creates mental slavery. Because wherever attention goes repeatedly, identity follows. This is why many people no longer know how to think independently. Their emotions belong to trends. Their confidence belongs to validation. Their focus belongs to distraction. Their peace belongs to circumstances. And that creates a fragile human being. A human being who constantly needs external conditions to feel internally stable. But the people who become mentally unbreakable understand something else. Your environment can influence you, but it does not have permission to define you. That is a completely different mentality. It means you stop treating your mind like an open territory. You begin guarding it like an empire. You become selective about conversations, selective about information, selective about who receives your energy, selective about what enters your thoughts repeatedly. Because you finally understand, mental strength is not built accidentally. It is protected intentionally. And here is where the transformation truly begins. The moment you stop asking, how do I avoid negativity? And start asking, how do I become stronger than it? That question changes everything. Because now you are no longer trying to escape pressure. You are developing internal authority. Now here is what almost nobody understands. There is a massive difference between people who react emotionally and people who govern themselves mentally. One group is controlled by emotion. The other controls emotion before emotion controls them. And this difference quietly determines who builds power and who keeps losing it. The difference between people who react and people who govern themselves. Most people think emotional control means suppressing feelings. It does not. Suppression is weakness pretending to be strength. Real mental discipline is different. It is the ability to feel emotion without surrendering direction. That is rare, because the average person lives emotionally exposed. Every frustration changes their behavior. Every inconvenience changes their mindset. Every moment of pressure changes the way they speak, think, decide, and act. They become different people depending on the situation. And this creates a dangerous internal condition, emotional instability. Now understand something important. A reactive person is easy to control. Why? Because anything external can move them. Fear moves them. Praise moves them. Criticism moves them. Comparison moves them. Urgency moves them. Pleasure moves them. Their internal state constantly depends on external triggers. That means their life has no solid center. And a person without a center eventually becomes mentally exhausted, because reaction consumes enormous energy. Think about how many people spend years emotionally reacting to everything. Reacting to delays, reacting to politics, reacting to social media, reacting to family, reacting to traffic, reacting to rejection, reacting to uncertainty. By the end of the day, their mind is completely scattered. Not because life destroyed them, but because they never learned how to hold their own position internally. And this is where mentally disciplined people separate themselves from the crowd. They do not react immediately to emotion. They pause, observe, interpret, then decide. That pause changes everything. Because between stimulus and response exists the space where power is built. But weak minds cannot tolerate that space. They need instant reaction, instant expression, instant anger, instant complaint, instant escape, instant emotional release. And every impulsive reaction strengthens the habit of losing control. Now here is the deeper issue. The more emotionally reactive a person becomes, the less clarity they have. Because strong emotions distort perception. Fear exaggerates problems. Anger destroys intelligence. Anxiety creates imaginary catastrophes. Insecurity creates false comparisons. And eventually, the person stops seeing reality clearly. They begin interpreting life through emotional chaos instead of objective vision. That is why mentally weak people often make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. They quit too early. They sabotage relationships. They abandon goals. They destroy opportunities, not because they lacked potential, but because emotion became their leader. Now compare that to a person with internal government. When pressure appears, they do not panic. When criticism appears, they do not collapse. When uncertainty appears, they do not abandon themselves. They remain emotionally steady long enough to think clearly. That is power. And this is one of the greatest hidden advantages in life. The calmer mind usually wins. Because clarity creates better decisions. Better decisions create consistency. And consistency creates results most people mistake for talent. But it was never talent alone. It was emotional regulation. Now here is something even deeper. People who constantly react emotionally often believe they are expressing authenticity. But uncontrolled emotion is not authenticity. It is lack of discipline. Because maturity is not feeling less. Maturity is letting wisdom become stronger than impulse. And once a person develops this level of control, something extraordinary begins happening. The environment loses power over them. Pressure loses power over them. Negativity loses power over them. Not because life became easier, but because their internal structure became stronger than external chaos. And this leads to the next level of transformation, because once you stop reacting emotionally to life, you can finally begin training your mind to search for power instead of problems. Train your mind to look for power instead of problems. Most people have unconsciously trained their minds to search for what is wrong. Wrong with life. Wrong with people. Wrong with the economy. Wrong with themselves. Wrong with the future. And after years of repeating this mental pattern, the brain becomes conditioned to detect negativity automatically. That is why some people walk into opportunity and still only see limitation. Their perception is programmed for problems. Now understand something profound. The mind always finds evidence for whatever it is trained to search for. If you train it to look for betrayal, it will notice betrayal everywhere. If you train it to look for rejection, it will interpret situations through rejection. If you train it to look for obstacles, it will magnify obstacles. But if you train it to look for possibility, discipline, growth, hidden opportunity, strength, solutions, your entire experience of reality begins changing. Not because the world changed overnight, but because your perception changed, and perception influences behavior. Behavior influences decisions. Decisions influence destiny. This is why attitude is not something superficial. It is strategic. A weak mentality asks, why is this happening to me? A powerful mentality asks, what is this trying to teach me? One creates victimhood. The other creates growth. Now be honest with yourself. How many times have you spent hours mentally feeding a problem instead of building a solution? How many times have you replayed frustration in your head until it became emotional poison? How many opportunities have disappeared because your focus stayed trapped inside fear? This is one of the greatest silent destroyers of mental strength. Negative fixation. The mind becomes addicted to rehearsing pain. And eventually, the person starts identifying with struggle itself. They become emotionally attached to suffering, attached to complaint, attached to being misunderstood, attached to repeating old wounds. And this creates a dangerous internal identity, the identity of someone who expects life to go wrong. Now here's the problem. Expectation influences behavior more than people realize. A person expecting failure hesitates. A person expecting rejection withdraws. A person expecting disappointment loses intensity. And over time, these small emotional behaviors silently sabotage results. But mentally strong people develop another habit entirely. They deliberately redirect focus. not through fake positivity, through intentional interpretation. When difficulty appears, they ask, where is the lesson? Where is the hidden advantage? Where can I grow? What can this develop inside me? That question changes the emotional direction of the mind, because energy follows meaning, and meaning is chosen. This is why two people can experience the exact same hardship and become completely different human beings afterward. One becomes resentful. The other becomes wiser. One becomes emotionally bitter. The other becomes emotionally disciplined. One spends years replaying the pain. The other extracts strength from it. The event was not the final decision. The interpretation was, and this reveals something extremely important. Your future is shaped less by what happens to you, and more by what your mind repeatedly does with what happens. That is why mentally disciplined people guard interpretation carefully. They know the human mind is programmable. Every repeated thought becomes easier to think again. Every emotional pattern becomes stronger through repetition. Every focus becomes identity over time. So instead of training the brain to obsess over weakness, they train it to search for strength. And eventually, this creates something rare, mental resilience. The ability to remain internally stable, even while life becomes unstable. But there is still an invisible enemy destroying millions of people before resilience can fully develop. An enemy so normalized that most people never question it. And the worst part is, many people practice it every single day without realizing they are poisoning their own minds. The hidden enemy: complaining, self-pity, and weak internal dialogue. One of the fastest ways to destroy a positive mental attitude is through repeated negative speech. Not only what you say to others, what you constantly say to yourself. Because the mind is always listening. And most people have no idea how destructive their internal dialogue has become. They say things like, my life is stressful. I'm always tired. Nothing ever works for me. I can't stay disciplined. I'm not mentally strong. I always mess things up. At first, these sentences feel harmless. But repetition transforms language into identity, and identity controls behavior. Now understand something deeper. Every time you verbally reinforce weakness, your mind treats it like instruction. The brain does not simply hear repeated language. It adapts to it. That means many people are unconsciously programming limitation into themselves every single day. Not because they want failure, but because they constantly rehearse it emotionally. And this is where complaining becomes dangerous. Complaining feels emotionally relieving in the moment, but psychologically, it trains powerlessness. It conditions the mind to focus on what cannot be controlled. And eventually, the person loses the habit of personal responsibility. Now notice the pattern. Weak people constantly explain why they cannot move forward. Strong people focus on what they can still do next. That difference changes entire lives. Because energy directed toward excuses disappears. Energy directed toward action multiplies. But here is the deeper problem almost nobody sees. Self-pity is emotionally addictive. There is a hidden comfort in feeling like the victim. Victimhood removes responsibility. It allows the person to emotionally justify inaction. If people understood me, if life were easier, if I had more support, if circumstances were different. And little by little, the person stops building power. They start building emotional dependency. Dependency on ideal conditions. Dependency on validation. Dependency on motivation. Dependency on sympathy. But life does not reward dependency. It rewards internal leadership. That is why mentally disciplined people monitor language carefully. Not because words are magic, but because words shape focus. And focus shapes emotional direction. A person constantly speaking weakness begins feeling weak. A person constantly rehearsing limitation begins expecting limitation. Eventually, the mind accepts those emotional patterns as reality. Now, this does not mean you deny difficulty. It means you stop worshiping difficulty emotionally. That is different. A mentally strong person can acknowledge pain without building identity around pain. They can admit challenge without surrendering authority. They can experience pressure without collapsing internally. That is real positivity, not emotional performance, internal command. And this reveals another hidden truth. Many people are not exhausted because life is too hard. They are exhausted because their internal dialogue never allows them to recover. Their mind is constantly attacking itself. Constant worry, constant criticism, constant fear, constant comparison, constant emotional noise. Imagine living every day with an internal voice that weakens you repeatedly. Eventually, motivation disappears. Clarity disappears. Hope disappears. Not because opportunity vanished, but because the internal environment became toxic. And this is why mental discipline begins with observation. You must become aware of the way you speak internally. Because whatever dominates internal conversation eventually dominates emotional reality. Now here is the powerful shift. The moment you stop feeding weakness emotionally, you create space for strength to grow. And once that happens, positivity stops being something forced. It becomes part of your identity. But this leads to the deepest level of the entire conversation. Because true positive mental attitude is not a technique you occasionally practice. It is a new way of becoming. Positive mental attitude is identity, not technique. Most people treat positivity like a temporary strategy. Something they use when they need motivation. Something they practice after failure. Something they try for a few days before returning to old patterns. But this approach never creates transformation. Because techniques can influence behavior temporarily, only identity changes behavior permanently. And this is the mistake that keeps millions trapped in cycles. They try to act positive without becoming someone internally different. So eventually, the old mindset returns. The old emotional reactions return. The old fears return. The old habits return. Because identity always pulls behavior back to what feels familiar. Now understand this carefully. You do not consistently act according to your goals. You consistently act according to who you believe you are. That changes everything. A person who secretly identifies as weak will unconsciously sabotage strength. A person who identifies as unlucky will unconsciously expect failure. A person who identifies as emotionally unstable will unconsciously return to emotional chaos. Not because they consciously want suffering, but because the mind always tries to remain loyal to identity. This is why many people self-sabotage the moment life begins improving. Success feels unfamiliar. Peace feels unfamiliar. Discipline feels unfamiliar. So the subconscious mind pulls them back toward emotional patterns they recognize. Toward distraction. Toward negativity. Toward inconsistency. Toward emotional drama. Because familiarity feels safe, even when it is destructive. Now here is the shift mentally powerful people make. They stop asking, how can I stay positive? And begin asking, who must I become to naturally think, act, and respond differently? That is identity work. And identity work changes everything from the inside out. Because once the mind accepts a new self-image, behavior begins aligning automatically. A person who truly sees themselves as disciplined no longer negotiates basic responsibilities every day. A person who truly sees themselves as mentally strong stops collapsing over temporary discomfort. A person who truly sees themselves as focused stops feeding distraction constantly. Identity simplifies behavior. This is why powerful people protect self-image aggressively. They understand that repeated actions are not just producing results. They are producing a version of themselves. Every disciplined action reinforces discipline. Every controlled response reinforces emotional strength. Every intentional decision strengthens internal authority. And eventually, the person no longer needs constant motivation. because the behavior becomes natural. Now here is the dangerous reality. Most people reinforce weakness daily without noticing. Every excuse reinforces weakness. Every emotional outburst reinforces lack of control. Every procrastination reinforces inconsistency. Every moment of surrender reinforces helplessness. Little by little, the mind collects evidence about who you are. And eventually, that evidence becomes identity. That is why transformation is not built in giant traumatic moments. It is built in repeated invisible decisions. The decision to remain calm. The decision to continue when emotions fluctuate. The decision to protect focus. The decision to reject mental weakness. The decision to stop feeding negativity internally. This is what creates a mentally unbreakable person. Not one motivational moment, but repeated internal alignment. And here is the beautiful part. Once identity changes, external circumstances lose much of their control over you. Because now your behavior no longer depends entirely on emotion. It depends on internal standards. That is real power. But there is still one final truth most people never understand. Your life is not shaped only by events. It is shaped by the meaning you repeatedly attach to those events. And once you understand this law, you gain the power to reinterpret your entire reality. The law of interpretation. The meaning you give life becomes your reality. Life does not affect people equally. Interpretation does. That is one of the most important truths you will ever understand. Because events by themselves are neutral far more often than people realize. What changes human beings is the meaning attached to those events. And most people never consciously choose that meaning. They inherit it emotionally. A setback happens, and immediately they interpret it as failure. A rejection happens, and they interpret it as proof they are not valuable. A delay happens, and they interpret it as a sign nothing will work. But mentally powerful people interpret differently, not because they live easier lives, but because they refuse to let temporary events define permanent identity. And this is where positive mental attitude becomes truly powerful. It stops being emotional optimism and becomes conscious interpretation. Now understand something dangerous. The human mind naturally searches for emotional confirmation. If you believe life is against you, your brain will constantly search for evidence supporting that belief. You will notice obstacles more than opportunities, criticism more than support, problems more than progress. And eventually, your interpretation becomes emotional reality, not because reality objectively changed, but because focus changed. This is why hopeless people often feel trapped even when possibilities still exist. Their perception has become emotionally distorted. Now think about this carefully. Two people lose money. One says, "My life is ruined." The other says, "This forced me to become smarter." Two people experience rejection. One says, "I am not enough." The other says, "This is redirection." Two people face hardship. One becomes emotionally bitter. The other becomes emotionally disciplined. Same pressure. Different interpretation. Different destiny. And this reveals a truth the average person avoids. You cannot always control events, but you can train the meaning your mind gives to those events. That is internal authority. Now, this does not mean every painful experience is secretly pleasant. Some seasons hurt deeply. Some losses change people forever. Some betrayals leave scars. Mental strength is not pretending pain does not exist. Mental strength is refusing to let pain become your ruler. That is the difference. Because weak minds ask, "Why is this happening?" Strong minds ask, "What can this build inside me?" That question transforms suffering into training, and training creates power. Now here is something even deeper. Most people unknowingly relive emotional pain because they keep repeating the same interpretation. They replay old memories with the same emotional meaning again and again. And every repetition strengthens the emotional wound. Eventually, the past begins controlling the present, not because the event is still happening, but because the interpretation is still active. This is why some people remain trapped emotionally for years after a difficult experience. The body left the situation. The mind never did. But mentally disciplined people understand they must eventually reinterpret the past if they want to reclaim the future, not to deny what happened, but to extract strength from it instead of identity loss. That is healing through power. Now imagine what happens when a person finally learns this law. Every setback becomes training. Every difficulty becomes development. Every delay becomes preparation. Every challenge becomes mental conditioning. Suddenly, life stops looking like punishment and starts looking like construction. That mentality changes human beings completely, because now the person is no longer emotionally collapsing every time life becomes uncomfortable. Now they are building internal resilience through interpretation itself. And this leads to the final stage of transformation, because understanding these principles means nothing unless you begin applying them daily with discipline. Practical command: how to build an unbreakable positive mental attitude. A powerful mindset is not built through inspiration. It is built through repetition, daily repetition, because the mind becomes whatever it repeatedly practices, not occasionally, repeatedly. This is why many people stay mentally weak even after consuming powerful content. They listen, feel motivated, understand the message, and then return to the exact same mental habits, the same conversations, the same distractions, the same emotional reactions, the same internal dialogue. And eventually, the old identity returns. Because information alone does not transform anyone. Conditioning does. Now understand this clearly. You cannot build a strong mind while feeding weak patterns every day. Impossible. Mental strength requires deliberate training. And the first step is this: stop allowing emotions to automatically control behavior. This is where real discipline begins. Do not wait to feel motivated to act correctly. Act correctly long enough for your identity to change. That is how mentally powerful people are built. They train consistency before emotion agrees. Now here is the second command: protect your mental environment aggressively. Most people protect money more carefully than they protect attention. But attention shapes identity, and identity shapes destiny. So begin observing what constantly enters your mind. What conversations weaken you? What content poisons your focus? What people normalize negativity? What habits destroy clarity? Because if you repeatedly expose your mind to chaos, distraction, fear, and emotional weakness, eventually your internal world will mirror those conditions. Mental strength requires selective exposure. Now here is the third command: replace emotional reaction with conscious pause. This alone can change your life. The next time frustration appears, pause. The next time anger rises, pause. The next time fear enters your mind, pause, not to suppress emotion, but to regain authority before responding. Because every controlled response strengthens internal government, and every impulsive reaction strengthens mental weakness. Now here is the fourth command: train your mind to search for strength daily. Not once a week, daily. Ask yourself, what did this situation teach me? Where did I grow today? What weakness must I eliminate? What discipline must I strengthen? What thought pattern must I stop feeding? These questions slowly reprogram perception, and perception changes emotional direction. Now here is another important truth. You must stop speaking weakness over your own life. Your words matter because repetition matters. Stop rehearsing defeat. Stop reinforcing limitation emotionally. Stop building identity around exhaustion, fear, inconsistency, and struggle. That does not mean lying to yourself. It means refusing to emotionally worship weakness. Instead, begin reinforcing internal authority. I can remain disciplined. I can control my focus. I can train my mind. I can become emotionally stronger. I do not need perfect conditions to continue. That internal language changes the nervous system over time. Now here is the fifth command. Accept discomfort as part of transformation. Most people lose mental strength because they think discomfort means something is wrong. It does not. Discomfort often means growth is happening. A stronger identity always feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. Discipline feels uncomfortable at first. Emotional control feels uncomfortable at first. Silence feels uncomfortable at first. Responsibility feels uncomfortable at first. But eventually, those behaviors become part of who you are. And this is where real confidence is born, not from comfort, from self-respect. The respect earned by repeatedly keeping control of yourself. Now understand the deeper reality. Every day you are either training your mind toward power or training it toward weakness. There is no neutral direction. Every thought repeated matters. Every emotional pattern matters. Every reaction matters, because all of it is building identity silently. And once identity solidifies, your entire life begins changing around it. But before this video ends, there is one final truth you need to hear. A truth that separates people who temporarily improve from people who become permanently unbreakable. Become someone reality cannot break at the end of the day. Life will test everyone, not just a few people. Everyone. There will be moments of uncertainty, moments of pressure, moments of rejection, moments where plans fail, moments where progress feels invisible, moments where your emotions try to pull you back into fear, doubt, anger, distraction, and weakness. That is part of being human. But here is the difference that changes everything. Some people allow those moments to define them. Others use those moments to build themselves. And that choice quietly determines the direction of an entire life. Because reality is always observing one thing. Can you maintain internal order when external conditions become unstable? That is the real test. Not whether life is easy. Not whether everything goes according to plan. Not whether people support you constantly. The real test is whether you can remain mentally aligned when circumstances try to pull you out of alignment. And most people fail this test because they spend years training emotional reaction instead of emotional discipline. They react automatically. They panic automatically. They complain automatically. They surrender automatically. And after enough repetition, weakness becomes normal. But now you understand something deeper. A positive mental attitude is not blind optimism. It is internal command. It is the ability to govern your focus, your emotions, your interpretation, and your behavior, even when life becomes difficult. That is what creates mentally unbreakable people. Not motivation, not temporary inspiration, daily internal leadership. And now the responsibility becomes yours. Because from this point forward, you can no longer say you do not understand why the mind collapses. You know, it collapses when the environment becomes stronger than identity. It collapses when emotion becomes stronger than discipline. It collapses when negative interpretation becomes stronger than conscious direction. But it becomes powerful when you reverse that process. When discipline becomes stronger than mood. When interpretation becomes stronger than fear. When identity becomes stronger than circumstance. That is where transformation begins. So from today forward, practice these commands intentionally. Guard your mind like territory. Control what receives your attention. Stop feeding negative internal dialogue. Pause before emotional reaction. Interpret hardship as training. Strengthen discipline daily. And most importantly, stop identifying yourself as fragile. Because the human mind adapts to whatever it repeatedly practices. If you practice weakness, weakness grows. If you practice emotional control grows. If you practice resilience, resilience grows. That is the law. And once you truly understand this, you stop waiting for life to become easier. You become stronger instead. Before you leave, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every video here is designed to strengthen your mind, sharpen your discipline, and help you build a life with more power, clarity, and purpose. And comment below, I control my mind. Write it with intention. Because the moment a person learns to govern themselves internally, reality loses the power to break them.